Some fathers are meant to protect. But what happens when the very hands that should shelter become the ones that destroy? In a world where trust is sacred, betrayal cuts the deepest. This is the chilling tale of a boy whose life was stolen not by fate, but by the man who gave him life. Love turned to poison. Hope drowned in silence, and innocence met its cruelest end. The father who killed his son. Born to die by his father's hand forces us to confront the darkest side of family, a side most dare not imagine. Caleb's silent cries in a broken home were not the kind of cries one could hear echoing through hallways or spilling into the night. They were not loud or dramatic, not the sort that rattled windows or made neighbors knock in concern. His cries lived in the shadows, muffled beneath his breath, pressed into the fabric of a pillow, or trapped behind clenched teeth when he knew that the sound of weakness would only invite more cruelty. He had learned far too young that sound carried consequences. In his house, silence was survival. Silence was the only armor he had left, fragile as it was. The walls of Caleb's home were old, faded with years of neglect, yet they had become witnesses to countless moments of despair. Paint peeled from corners, photographs hung crooked on nails, and the scent of cigarettes and stale alcohol lingered in the air, never fully washed away no matter how many windows were opened. To the outside world, the house was just another ordinary American home, sitting in a quiet neighborhood where children played on bicycles and porch lights flickered on at dusk. But to Caleb, every creak of the floorboards, every slam of a door, every heavy footstep down the hallway was a warning. His world was not one of safety. It was a stage of tension, where his father's moods dictated whether the night ended in uneasy peace or unspoken terror. Caleb was 10, old enough to understand the difference between right and wrong, old enough to know that fathers were supposed to protect their children, not break them. Yet he was still young enough to cling to fragments of hope, still desperate for moments where his father might smile or ruffle his hair, or tell him he was proud. Those rare glimpses, brief and fleeting, were the cruelest part of it all, because they convinced him to hold on longer, to endure more. It was as if love dangled just out of reach, a promise that could be snatched away at the slightest misstep. And so Caleb tried harder to be perfect, quieter, invisible even. His cries often came at night when the house had settled into a false calm. His father's anger usually followed long evenings of drinking, when the sharp smell of whiskey announced that the storm was brewing. By then, Caleb had already retreated to his room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his back against the bed, pretending to read while his eyes traced the same sentence over and over. He had trained his ears to listen for patterns, the shift in his father's voice when it deepened into something dangerous, the scrape of a chair against the kitchen floor, the heavy silence that came before an outburst. His mother, Sarah, moved through those moments like a ghost, careful not to disturb anything that could ignite the fire further. Her silence was different from his. Hers was laced with fear, with resignation, with the heavy knowledge of someone who had already lost too much. When Caleb did cry, it was always quiet, hidden. He would bury his face in his pillow, trying to smother the trembling of his chest, the sharp stabs of breath that made his ribs ache. The tears weren't only from pain, they were from confusion. He could not understand why his father looked at him with such disdain, why every small mistake, spilled milk, a misplaced shoe, a grade lower than expected, felt like an invitation for rage. He wanted to believe that somewhere inside the man who had once carried him on his shoulders, there was still a father who loved him. That belief, fragile as glass, kept Caleb from breaking completely, even as he withered under the weight of his father's shadow. At school, Caleb wore his silence like a second skin. He laughed when others laughed, nodded when spoken to, and never complained. His teachers saw him as a quiet boy, polite and reserved, though sometimes his eyes seemed older than his years. His classmates rarely noticed him. He blended in, invisible by choice because standing out felt dangerous. The bruises were hidden well enough, long sleeves in summer, a scarf pulled higher on cold mornings, but it was the emptiness in his eyes that told the real story. Though no one dared to read it, every night, when Caleb lay in his bed staring at the cracks in the ceiling, he wondered if tomorrow would be different. He wondered if his father would wake up and forget his rage, if his mother would find the strength to speak up, if the house would ever feel like a home instead of a prison. But hope was dangerous too, because it made the disappointment cut deeper when reality returned like a knife twisting into his chest. He had learned to prepare for disappointment, to expect it so it would hurt less. Yet no matter how hard he tried, the longing for love never went away. Caleb's cries were not loud, but they were endless. They lived in his bones. In the quiet way his hands shook when he tried to hold a pencil. In the way his shoulders curled inward as though trying to shield his heart. They were there in the moments when he sat by the window, staring out at the kids riding bikes in freedom he could not taste. They were there when his mother kissed his forehead, her lips trembling as though she wished her touch could erase his pain. They were there in every breath he took, heavy with the weight of fear and the ache of wanting something he might never have. The broken home wasn't made of wood and brick. It was made of silence, of unspoken terror, of shattered trust that could never be rebuilt. Caleb lived inside it, a child born into shadows, clinging to a sliver of light that seemed to grow dimmer with every passing day. His cries would never echo down the halls for the world to hear, but they carved themselves into him, leaving marks that no one could see. And though he tried to remain invisible, to survive the storm by disappearing into silence, his very existence was a reminder of the battle he fought every day, an unending war between fear and hope, between love and cruelty, between a boy's need for his father and the harsh reality of the man who denied him. A father's hidden rage beneath a calm face was the most terrifying kind of monster Caleb had ever known, because it wore a mask of normalcy. To the outside world, Daniel Whitaker was a man who blended in, a man with steady eyes, a firm handshake, and the kind of presence that neighbors greeted politely without question. He smiled at church gatherings, nodded respectfully at the grocery store, and exchanged small talk with coworkers as if nothing lingered beneath the surface. To them, he was ordinary. To Caleb, he was unpredictable, a storm that hid behind still skies, waiting for the right moment to strike. Daniel's calmness was its own form of cruelty. There were evenings when he would sit at the kitchen table, his face unreadable, sipping slowly from a glass of whiskey while Caleb fidgeted nervously nearby. No harsh words, no sudden movements, just silence and that measured, steady stare that felt heavier than any outburst. In those moments, Caleb didn't know what was worse: the rage when it erupted loud and violent, or the quiet stretches of calm that were never truly calm, only the stillness of a predator studying his prey. The boy would sit with his hands clasped tightly, pretending to be engrossed in his homework, though every muscle in his body screamed with tension, waiting for the sudden crack of his father's voice or the violent slam of a fist against the table. What made Daniel so dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize. He could go from calmly telling Caleb about responsibility to twisting his words into an accusation that cut deeper than any belt or slap. He spoke in riddles of disappointment, making the boy question himself, planting guilt in his chest that he carried like a second heartbeat. "You think I don't notice your mistakes?" he would murmur, voice low, even gentle, as if it were a secret between them. "You embarrass me without even realizing it." His tone never rose. His face never twisted into a snarl, and yet the words burrowed into Caleb, making him shrink smaller, quieter, less of himself. Behind closed doors, Daniel's rage was not always physical. Sometimes it was silence stretched so thin it became unbearable. He could ignore his son for days, acting as though Caleb's existence was nothing more than an irritation, a buzzing insect in the corner of the room. Then, without warning, that silence would shatter and the rage would pour out like gasoline meeting flame. A plate thrown against the wall, a chair kicked over, a hand gripping Caleb's shoulder so hard it left finger-shaped bruises. The violence wasn't constant, but its unpredictability made it worse. Caleb never knew what version of his father would appear: the calm man sipping whiskey or the beast whose eyes burned with hatred. Sarah, Caleb's mother, understood the duality of her husband too well. She had seen the mask he wore in public, the way people respected him, even admired him. She had also felt the weight of his hidden rage, the way his words could cut her down to nothing in the span of a breath. She knew how carefully she had to tread, how her silence was a form of survival just as Caleb's was. Sometimes she would catch her son's eye across the dinner table, both of them reading the tension in Daniel's calm expression, both of them silently bracing for what might come next. For Caleb, the worst part of his father's calm face was the betrayal of it. That face should have been a source of comfort, a sign of protection. Instead, it was a mask, a lie, a weapon sharpened by years of practice. He learned to fear smiles as much as scowls, to mistrust gentle tones as much as angry shouts. In Daniel's calm there was no peace, only the suffocating certainty that rage lurked just beneath, waiting for the moment when the mask would slip and the storm would finally break. The mother's fear, trapped in silence, was like a shadow that followed Sarah Whitaker everywhere she went. It wasn't just fear of the man she had once loved, the man she thought she could trust. It was fear of what speaking up might unleash, fear of what would happen if she shattered the fragile facade that kept their home standing. Every day she carried the weight of unsaid words, swallowed cries, and half-formed thoughts that never dared to escape her lips. Her silence was not weakness, it was survival. It was the desperate calculation of a woman who knew that one wrong sentence could ignite a fire she couldn't put out. Sarah had once been full of life. Her friends remembered her as the kind of woman who laughed loudly, who lit up rooms with her energy, who dreamed of a warm, safe home filled with love. But years with Daniel had hollowed her. Each insult, each slammed door, each unpredictable outburst stripped pieces away until only fragments remained. Now she moved through the house like a ghost, her steps measured, her words chosen with surgical precision. She spoke softly, rarely more than necessary, always scanning Daniel's face for the slightest sign of change. To outsiders, she appeared shy, reserved, maybe tired. Inside, she was drowning in fear, suffocating beneath the silence she wrapped around herself like armor. Her silence came with guilt, too. She knew Caleb saw more than she wanted him to. She knew he felt the tension in her hesitation, the way her eyes darted away when Daniel's voice grew sharp, the way she sometimes pressed her lips together as if holding back a scream. She longed to protect her son, to scoop him into her arms and run far away. But the invisible chains of fear kept her rooted. She told herself stories to survive. If she stayed quiet, maybe Daniel would calm down. If she stayed quiet, maybe Caleb would escape his father's notice. If she stayed quiet, maybe tomorrow would be better. But silence only fed the monster, and deep down she knew it. There were nights when Sarah sat alone in the dark kitchen after Daniel had gone to bed, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea she never drank. She would stare at the shadows on the wall, listening to the steady hum of the refrigerator, and imagine a different life, a life where Caleb could laugh freely, where her heart didn't skip with fear every time a key turned in the lock. She thought about leaving more times than she could count. But fear whispered to her in Daniel's voice, "You'll never survive without me. You can't protect him on your own. Who would believe you?" The silence became her prison, a cell she locked herself in because breaking free felt impossible. Caleb felt her silence as much as he felt his father's rage. It was in the way her hands trembled when she brushed his hair from his forehead, in the way she lingered at his bedroom door as if trying to apologize with her eyes. He wanted her to speak, to fight for him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but her lips stayed sealed. She was afraid of losing what little control she had left, afraid that speaking out would not save him but destroy them both. And so, mother and son lived in parallel silence, his cries buried in pillows, her pleas buried in her throat. Sarah's silence was not emptiness. It was filled with all the things she could not say. It was filled with the terror of nights when Daniel's footsteps shook the floorboards, with the guilt of watching Caleb shrink smaller every day, with the crushing helplessness of knowing that love alone could not shield her child. It was a silence that screamed louder than words, echoing through every corner of their broken home. A silence that promised safety but delivered despair. Secrets buried in the heart of a small town were like roots twisting beneath the soil, hidden from sight, but strong enough to choke anything that tried to grow above them. The Whitakers' home sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, where neighbors waved from their porches and children raced their bikes under the fading glow of streetlights. To anyone passing by, it was a picture of ordinary American life. A family of 3, a modest house, a car parked neatly in the driveway. But beneath that facade, behind the drawn curtains and polite nods, lay truth so dark that the town itself seemed to conspire in keeping them hidden. Small towns thrive on appearances, and Crescent Falls was no exception. People gossiped about everything from who missed Sunday service to whose lawn grew a little too wild. Yet when it came to Daniel Whitaker, the whispers stopped short. He was respected in ways Caleb could never understand. A dependable worker at the factory, a man who volunteered during community events, a father who seemed quiet but strong. This was the version the town chose to see. And if there were cracks in that image, If someone glimpsed the sharpness in his eyes or the bruises Sarah tried to cover with long sleeves, they pretended not to. In Crescent Falls, it was easier to look away than to confront what festered in plain sight. The secrets began long before Caleb was old enough to recognize them. Sarah had once tried to confide in a close friend, a neighbor who noticed her trembling hands and tired eyes, but the words had barely left her lips before she was met with the kind of silence that told her everything. People did not want to know. People did not want their illusion of safety shattered. That silence taught Sarah a lesson. Keep the truth buried, because the soil of Crescent Falls was not fertile for honesty. The town protected its own myths, and Daniel was part of that myth. Caleb, though young, felt the weight of those secrets pressing down on him. He noticed how adults looked at him strangely sometimes, how they asked questions that seemed innocent but carried a hidden edge. He noticed how his teachers avoided prying too deeply when he showed up to class with tired eyes or flinched at sudden noises. He even overheard a conversation once, two women at the grocery store murmuring about how quiet the Whitakers seemed, how Sarah used to be so lively, their voices carrying just enough suspicion to stir curiosity, but never enough to take action. Everyone knew something, but no one dared to name it. The town's silence gave Daniel power. He knew he was untouchable, wrapped in a shield of reputation and willful ignorance. He could walk through the local diner, shake hands with the sheriff, nod at the pastor, and all the while carry his darkness home where no one would see. And when Caleb felt the sting of his father's hidden rage or the suffocating grip of his mother's silence, he wondered why no one came. Didn't anyone hear the unspoken cries that clung to the walls of their house? Didn't anyone see the truth buried beneath the surface smiles? Secrets in Crescent Falls were not just personal, they were communal. The town thrived on what was left unsaid, building its sense of order on the sacrifice of truth. And in the Whitaker home, those buried secrets became chains, binding Caleb tighter with each passing day, reminding him that even beyond the walls of his house, the world preferred silence over truth, shadows over light. The night trust shattered forever came quietly, disguised as any other evening in the Whitaker home. The air was thick with the bitter scent of whiskey, clinging to Daniel's clothes as he sat at the kitchen table, his face calm in that unnerving way Caleb had learned to dread. The house was too still, the silence carrying a weight that pressed down on Sarah and her son like an invisible hand. Caleb sat in his room, knees pulled to his chest, listening intently to the muffled sounds beyond his door, the scrape of a chair against the tile, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of his mother's footsteps as she tried to move without notice. Every sound seemed louder in the stillness, every pause more dangerous than the noise itself.
He knew what it meant.
The storm was coming. When Daniel finally called for him, Caleb's heart dropped into his stomach. His father's voice wasn't raised, wasn't angry. It was steady, almost gentle. That was always the worst. Rage shouted. Calmness deceived. As Caleb stepped into the kitchen, he saw his father sitting with a half-empty glass in hand, eyes locked on him with a sharpness that cut deeper than any blow. Sit, Daniel said simply, and Caleb obeyed. Sarah lingered in the doorway, her hands twisting together, her lips pressed tight as though she could hold back the night itself by refusing to speak. The questions began the same way they always did, small, harmless on the surface. Did Caleb finish his homework? Did he remember what he was told the other day? Did he think he was being responsible? Caleb answered quietly, carefully, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound steady. Every word felt like stepping through a minefield, unsure which answer would ignite the explosion he feared. But Daniel's expression never changed. His face stayed calm, unreadable, the storm hidden just behind his steady gaze. Then came the moment. The glass slammed against the table, not broken but loud enough to jolt Caleb's body with terror. Daniel leaned forward, his voice still even but dripping with venom. You embarrass me, he said. Every time you open your mouth, every time you walk into a room, you remind me of failure. Caleb's throat tightened, his eyes stung, but he held the tears back. Crying made it worse. Crying made him weak in his father's eyes, and weakness was never forgiven. Sarah took a step forward, but Daniel's glare froze her in place. Her silence wrapped around her like chains, keeping her rooted while her son sat trembling under the weight of words that crushed more than fists ever could. Caleb lowered his head, staring at his small hands clenched in his lap, wishing he could disappear, wishing the ground would open and swallow him whole. The trust he had clung to, the fragile, desperate hope that maybe his father could change. Maybe love could still exist in that house, cracked under the weight of those words. In that moment, Caleb understood something he had tried to deny for years. His father didn't see him as a son. He didn't see him as someone to guide, to love, to protect. He saw him as a burden, a disappointment, a reminder of something broken that could never be fixed. That realization cut deeper than any wound. It was the death of trust, the end of hope. And though Caleb sat there silently, not daring to breathe too loudly, something inside him fractured beyond repair. The night seemed endless, the shadows thicker, the silence heavier, and though no one outside that house would ever know what had truly happened, Caleb would carry it forever, etched into him like scars that never healed. The final park smelled like rain and cut grass, a place where the town came to breathe after long days and pretend the world was simple. That night it had become something else, a stage for truth, a place where hidden things were pulled up by the roots and shown under the yellow wash of a street lamp. People gathered at the edge of the grass, faces pale and tight, their murmurs folding into the rustle of leaves. Sarah stood pressed against a bench, fingers white around the strap of her purse, Caleb's memory a live thing between her ribs. She had not meant to come. She had only followed the hush that drew the town there, the kind of hush that meant something had cracked open and would not be hidden again. Daniel arrived last, slow and deliberate, like a man walking toward something he expected to own. He kept his hat in one hand, his jaw set, the same composed mask he wore at the grocery store or the factory. Around him, people shifted, some with pity, some with a cold sort of calculation. This is how small towns decided which loyalties would survive. The sheriff stood slightly apart, the badge catching the light, a man who had carried the town's secrets for longer than any of them admitted. His eyes, however, were not on Daniel, but on the ground, on a folded piece of paper that had been left there earlier, soaked at the edges, a confession no one had wanted to accept but everyone had read. The paper carried more than words. It carried what could no longer be buried, dates, names, the raw map of a night that had once been layered in excuses. It had been found behind a loose board in the Whitaker shed, part letter and part apology written in a hand that trembled with denial and pride. It was the kind of thing that made faces go slack and shoulders slump, because when proof lands in a town that favors silence, the entire foundation trembles. Someone whispered Caleb's name and it rolled down the line of neighbors until it hit the edges of the park like a stone. Justice in Crescent Falls had never been quick. It moved like a river, slow and patient, wearing down rocks with time rather than force. But on this night the river had shifted. People who had swallowed questions for years felt the shift under their feet, and realized they could no longer keep walking as if nothing had happened. Mothers clutched their children a little tighter. Men who had once shaken Daniel's hand stepped back. The sheriff spoke then, not loud, not theatrical, but with the steady cadence of someone who had weighed the cost of action and decided it was time. He read parts of the paper aloud, not every detail, but enough for the truth to stand naked between the rows of benches and the playground swing that creaked in the wind. Daniel's face did not change. It was as if he had been carved from something that weather did not touch. But his hands betrayed him. They curled at his sides, then unclenched, then trembled once as if recognizing the end of an arrangement he had counted on. The crowd edged forward, some to hear, some to judge, some simply because the act of witnessing made them feel less complicit. Sarah's breath came in small, sharp bursts. The air tasted metallic like the moment before rain breaks. She remembered the first time Daniel had promised to protect them, the way his voice had sounded then, soft and convincing. The memory was a knife now, cutting through nostalgia. The question hung. What did justice mean here? Arrest, a trial, confessions whispered in church basements? For Caleb, justice could never bring back a laugh, a scraped knee, the small bright things stolen along with his life. But it could change the narrative, remove the shield that had allowed cruelty to walk unchallenged. It could force a town to look at itself and decide whether it would keep choosing appearances over truth. The sheriff moved toward Daniel and spoke the kind of words that unstitched reputations. People snapped their heads, eyes wet, mouths open, as if they were watching a curtain fall and revealing a stage no one had wanted to see. As they led Daniel away, the park seemed to inhale, the hush broken not by triumph but by a hollow sort of mourning. Some neighbors crossed their arms. Others bent to cry into their hands. Sarah reached for the bench where Caleb had once sat eating an ice cream cone with a smile that could have lit the place, and her fingers found only the cold wood. The justice that clawed through blood ties had arrived messy and incomplete, leaving raw edges and questions that would not settle. Above them, the swings kept moving, pushed by the evening wind, creaking like a slow, accusing clock.